Hello and welcome to Sleep is My Waking Passion, the podcast where we get real about sleep and how it shapes your life. I'm Dr. Allison Cole, a triple-boarded pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine physician who's learned to thrive despite having chronic insomnia. And now I'm here to help you do the same. Hello and welcome to Season 6 of the Sleep is My Waking Passion podcast. This is going to be a part 2, if you will, of a 2-part series where I'm talking to folks who do crazy ultra marathon kind of things. So today I have with me a really super cool guest. This is Chris Thomas. He is a pharmacist and MBA by training. He works in the pharmaceutical industry. He has some expertise in pulmonary hypertension. That is what he does by day. But by night, I don't know if that's actually correct, but his side hustle, if you will, is being an ultra paddler. Is that the appropriate description? Are you part of the Ultra Paddle League? I don't know if there's a better way to describe it.
Well, there's not a league that I know of. It's actually a pretty niche sport. So what I would call it is simply ultramarathon paddle racing. And that can be anything from, for example, a stand-up paddleboard, a kayak, a canoe. There are various other crafts that folks can use. But really, it's basically, to sum it up, it's paddling over really, really long distances over several days. So, for example, anything from, 48 hours, for example, all the way up to 10 days.
Wow. So we're talking about real extreme athleticism here. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring Chris on is because it's a different flavor and a different style. A lot of people have heard of marathoning or even ultra marathoning, where you're just running or walking for large distances. And that may also take a few days as well, depending on the type of race. But, there are some sort of unique challenges, particularly when it comes to sleep. So Chris and he reached out and I was like, yeah, let's totally do an episode on this because it kind of was very reminiscent when we initially spoke to what military folks go through in their training, because they may be on a tour where they know that they're not going to be getting a whole lot of sleep. And so some of the techniques that are applied can kind of apply both. There's some literature in military, and there's some literature, though it's not effusive, in folks that do various sort of ultra marathon type sports. Often what I found was kind of in running, but I think it sort of does apply here as well. So I guess what I'd start, because many of my listeners may not be too familiar with what goes on with paddling. Can you sort of describe in your niche sport what can be expected in terms of where do you even sleep? You mentioned 10-day races versus some of the shorter races. Where do you really see the real challenges being in terms of like the length of race for what you're doing?
That's a really good question. Just to give the listeners an idea of what kind of distances we're talking about, we're talking really about anything from, for example, the shortest one that I can think of where sleep deprivation can be an issue is maybe 70 miles, in which the race starts in Seattle, but it starts at night in the evening. And so right off the bat, you're already paddling through the night and you're not sleeping, for example, that first night. All the way up to, for example, a 1,000-mile race or even a 650-mile race. And the reason I put those two together, so while a 1,000-mile race is the longest race in the world, it is very comparable in terms of the times in which the 650-mile race in Alabama, for example, are completed. And the reason for that is specifically related to water flow. So the Yukon 1000 is on a river that's a very fast-flowing river. So the winners will typically finish around 6 to 7 days, for example, with the time limit being up to 10 days. And in the Alabama 650, which goes throughout most of the state of Alabama, finishers will typically finish in about the same amount of time. But the difference there is that the water flow on that river system is essentially non-existent because there are dams throughout the river system, so it doesn't flow very much. The longest races are going to be typically around 6, 7, up to 10 days, for example. To give you an idea of how much sleep happens during that time period. So the Yukon 1000, there are specific rules for that race in which paddlers are only allowed to paddle for 18 hours a day. So they have to be stopped for 6 hours. The reason for that is it's a very remote race, and they're trying to protect racers from themselves because they know that sleep deprivation is a huge issue, and your mental capacity certainly isn't as great as if you just woke up from an 8 hour sleep. And the water up there is very cold. So if you make mistakes and you tip your kayak, for example, because you're so sleep deprived, you can be in a life-threatening situation very quickly, with the fastest rescue maybe being 24 hours, most likely being 72, or even up to 5 days to get out. And so that's one of the
Wow.
reasons why that format, they require racers to stop for 6 hours. Now, does that mean that you're sleeping for 6 hours? Absolutely not, because you stop and then you get out of your kayak and you're walking like a newborn baby giraffe, because you've been sitting in one place for 18 hours in a confined cockpit, or standing, for example, if you're on a stand-up paddleboard. And then you have to do a variety of different things. So you have to unpack the kayak, set up camp. Nature is probably calling, for example, at that time. You also have to attend to different injuries that you have, whether it be your hands or your back, or your butt, for example. Also go through with your partner, because that race requires a partner. So you have to go through things like what went well throughout the day, talk about the race strategy for tomorrow and what we want to improve. And so really you don't get a whole lot of sleep in that 6 hours. So I've done that race twice. And for example, in 2023, I got 9 hours of sleep and we finished in 7 days. In 24, we were much better at that ground game and we finished in 6 days. And I would say probably in 6 days, I think I got maybe 11 hours of sleep. So much more sleep each night. But that was just because we were much better in the ground game. Now, if we talk about something like the Alabama 650, there are no restrictions on, for example, times that you have to stop, except for when you go through portages. And the reason for that is because the portages can be very long, and they don't want racers speeding through those portages when they're driving around the dam. And so that's really the only required stops there. So theoretically, a racer could go all the way through in that 6 days and not sleep at all. I don't know if anyone's actually ever done that or if it's possible, but typically people do get cat naps in, like take 30 minutes here or 2 hours there. It's also dependent upon weather too, because that race there's a risk of hurricanes and things like that. So, for example, this last year, there was a hurricane that came close by and there was a lot of bad weather. So many racers had to take longer breaks than they typically thought that they were. But long story short, there's not a lot of sleep going on in these races. Typically, the very competitive athletes will push through the first 48 hours and not sleep at all. And then after that, get 30 minutes here or 2 hours there, and really getting into like the single digit numbers of total sleep throughout that race, kind of like I described with the Yukon. So for some shorter races, it's certainly more doable to just push through and not sleep at all, especially if you want to be competitive. But there's not a lot of sleep going on in these races. Aside from those that want to do the race as more of a challenge rather than being competitive, which is totally okay. I'm not knocking that at all. But to be competitive, you're really trying to maximize your time on the water and maximize time paddling.
Well, one of the questions that you had brought up to me as we were prepping for this episode was, what's the stats on like whether or not this is even safe to do? And what are we looking at here, right? So
Right.
I figured I would at least level set with saying that one of the ways I approached the question was to kind of think about, hey, well, if we look at elite athletes who train hard consistently, and it doesn't mean that all of them are going to be chronically sleep deprived, but what does that really look like? And so I was able to find a study looking at Olympic athletes. It was sort of like all comers, and it was a retrospective cohort study. So they really took a group of people and kind of said, okay, well, we know this is your lifespan and we've followed you, and they've been Olympic athletes from the early 1900s all the way through 2012. And what they discovered was, for a host of reasons, probably the most impactful being reduced cardiovascular risk, because these are Olympic athletes that exercise, and you compare them to normals, they actually lived longer, like 5 years. So I didn't see any studies that were particular to ultra sports people, but I would imagine that at the end of the day, there's no signs that you don't live as long overall population-wise. But that would be a really interesting data points to uncover. So I don't think in the sense of, hey, you're doing this and there's this acute time that you're sort of prepping for, that you're going to be sleep deprived, that it's necessarily going to reduce your longevity overall. I think the bigger data points are what we know happens with people who chronically deprive themselves of sleep. What's interesting about that definition is when you look at research studies, and there's a lot of studies that are done, but typically they are looking at about a week of sleep deprivation and what's happening with that in terms of things that you had already alluded to, like how is your cognitive capacity? Are you functioning on all cylinders? What is happening physically to you? How are you doing what they call psychomotor vigilance testing and your reaction times and things? And if you compare that with how we would define chronic insomnia, for example, when I actually looked, I said, does the American Academy of Sleep Medicine actually have a very specific definition for what chronic means with sleep deprivation? Because the studies are like a week. So obviously that's a little different than real time. And they really sort of don't have a specific time frame like they do for insomnia, which is a minimum of 3 months. But it's sort of a chronic, persistent undersleeping. And that is extremely pervasive in not only the United States culture, but worldwide. We just don't get a ton of sleep. The data suggests that our average sleep time has decreased over the years when we started having the invention of electricity. And, well, I mean, we know we have smartphones and just a busy world that we live in, and a lot of light pollution in certain parts of the world, especially around major cities. So it would stand to reason that even though it's not well defined, it's really a lifestyle that we're dealing with. And if you look at it from the lifestyle perspective of people who day in and day out really are getting insufficient sleep, that's where we start to see some of the chronic health issues associated with getting less than 6 hours. There's data that supports that maybe you won't live as long as somebody who gets sufficient sleep. Again, I'm not here to fear monger, and I want to state that for the record. I'm just giving you data points. What it works for one particular individual may not work for many. And there's some people that 6 hours is considered to be sufficient. But the data suggests that if you're really kind of going under that, you're probably doing yourself a disservice. But there are other serious physical attributes that we know are not good for you. We know it suppresses your immune system. It may put you at risk for other types of comorbidities like high blood pressure or coronary artery disease or diabetes if you're getting insufficient sleep. Just to name a few. We know that sleep is really helpful for clearing out the evil humors in our brain. And there's some thoughts that if we get good quality sleep, that may help to kind of get some of the toxins flushed out of our brain, which may be good for our long-term memory and cognition. So, there's a lot of benefits to kind of prioritizing sleep. But the acute sleep deprivation in and of itself probably has, I would make an argument for, the biggest risk is in that acute period. Meaning when I'm thinking of it, I'm thinking, okay, what happens when you're acutely sleep deprived? And you mentioned it. It's like that you're more prone to getting in accidents, right? So the one thing that comes from the military literature for sure is they say that really 48 hours after that, you're really not considered to be great military material, meaning all the things that you're trained to do. Be neat, be attentive, be vigilant, all of that goes out the window. So the 48 hours seems to be that like absolute cap. But what I found fascinating, and I want to know your experience, Chris, I found literature that says that 80 percent of people who are doing races like you're talking about with the sleep deprivation, they start to hallucinate. I mean, have you experienced that? Because it sounds to be very, very prevalent.
Very prevalent, actually, and that's one of the reasons why I asked the question is because of the prevalence of hallucinations. And obviously, if you're hallucinating, you can have a risk of doing something really bad to yourself or to others, especially if you're on a team. I personally, I don't think that I've experienced hallucinations during these races. I will, however, most of the folks that I talk to that do these races do report that. The one very weird thing that happened to me in the 2023 Yukon 1000 was I experienced a half a day of deja vu. And it was the weirdest thing ever because everywhere I looked, whether I turned my head to the right or I turned my head to the left, I was like, I've seen this before. I've been here before, and I clearly hadn't. And maybe that was a form of a hallucination, but that I experienced, and it was one of the weirdest things that I've ever experienced in my life. Was that normally when you experience deja vu, it's just in an instant, but this lasts for hours. One of the other reasons why I asked the question is really more of a personal one too, because I've a history of Alzheimer's in my family, and I know of data relative to sleep and the incidence and prevalence of Alzheimer's. And so, in addition to the longevity question that I had, it was more along the lines of, are there risks of other potential negative things happening in the future, especially when you're thinking about an elite racer that may do multiple races a year. So for example, I know many people that do 4 or 5, maybe even 6 ultra races a year. We were talking a little bit about the acute versus chronic effects. So, would that person that does many races a year be more at risk for adverse things happening later on in life, maybe related or unrelated to longevity?
I think that's such an interesting question, and I think it's going to be those avenues of exploration.
Right.
I really couldn't find anything that's very specific in the literature, other than what was nice is they tried to break down the various issues that could happen with age with the Olympic athletes. Again, I know it's not necessarily apples to apples, but it appeared that there really wasn't any significant difference just in terms of cognitive impairment with time and your cognition. So my guess is there might be some acute kind of issue with you being able to really think clearly because you're sleep deprived. But at the same time, is that necessarily going to impact your mentation long term? So I think you're also doing something that's incredibly intense physically, and you've trained for it. You're not like, hey, I never do anything, and now I'm going to go do this ultra race, right? You're sort of training over time, and maybe there's something to that in terms of being, sort of physically prepared as well. And I think it's akin. I'd be really curious if they eventually find any literature on things like, because we know that if you do cold plunging, for example, there may be some positive adaptive effects. And I did find one, it was literally an N of 1. So it was a case study. And it was published fairly recently, 2021. And it was one of those ways of like, how do you combat the effects of sleep deprivation? And literally it was done in one male athlete. So guys, whenever you read about these case studies, they're interesting, but it does not mean that you now go and apply that to your life without understanding that you're doing so with just one person having done it and having it published. Okay. That does not a randomized trial make. But in preparation, they did a 6-week program where one day a week they did their usual training, but one day a week they actually did sleep deprive themselves. It was like every Sunday or so. And what they found was when they actually ended up doing their race, they found that their mental effort was a little bit it was almost like they conditioned themselves to be prepared for the sleep deprivation. They didn't have the same degree of like cognitive impairment. They didn't perceive that to be as much, and they didn't feel as tired. And so their mental effort on multiple days seemed to be better. So you could potentially train yourself for that. I do think that it kind of lends itself to the next sort of interesting question in my mind, which is, all right, well, great. We know we're going to be sleep deprived. Can we actually prepare for that, right? That's the other question is, what the heck can you do to prepare for this impending sleep deprivation? Now, I shared with you what they talked about being sleep deprivation training, an N of 1, right? But if you want more robust data, that exists for sleep banking. And that is essentially where you try to maximize your sleep. A lot of people will say 1 to 2 weeks prior to that big race. And that's often where the studies are. And again, studies are not reality, right? But I think it's a really, really great way that's been better validated to improve athletic performance. So they've done this. They will do it in military. They try to really encourage people to maximize the amount of sleep that they get because they're going to be more alert when they go into that sleep deprivation because they've already again, maximize the amount of sleep that they got before they go on something that they know will sleep deprive them. And they've also done that in, even athletes, basketball athletes. Sherry Ma did a great study, was like, hey, and she found it out totally by accident when she was researching at Stanford. She was like, everybody's telling me that they're just maxing what they're doing. They're getting more points. Like there was a lot of improvement going on with the players that she was testing. And that got her thinking, hey, there's really something to this maximal sleep banking. I think the key here is I would actually make the argument it's kind of about how you try to, if you're training heavily, I don't see an issue with even trying to create a system where you're banking sleep even for longer than just 1 to 2 weeks, as opposed to just doing it for that time frame. The reason I say that specifically is because we run the risk for people who are doing things like this. Chris, there's no way that you're going to tell me that you're not somebody who's uber organized, who's uber dedicated, who doesn't have some type A personality in you. You're doing an elite sport. So that means that there are going to be people that come with an elite sport mentality. And that often translates to other aspects of their life. And as a type A person who wanted to go to med school and wanted to do these things, the first thing that I gave up was sleep because I thought that was the smarter, better way to go, right? But had I known that, hey, there might be some tools for me to maximize my sleep beforehand, hey, can I do that? Well, I think it's one of those things, the harder you train, the harder you try, the faster you can go, and the more likely you are to succeed. Again, you're telling me about the uber athletic, competitive folks that are literally go without sleep for 2 days. That's great if you're flexible in your sleep. But I want to put, again, a little kind of asterisk or warning sign here that I certainly don't want anybody with the type A personality that really is a gunner, that goes for it. The one thing about sleep is that you can't necessarily take the same approach to your training as you can with sleep. Because forcing yourself to sleep for some people just isn't going to work. In fact, you may leave this conversation being like, my sleep is worse because I'm trying to force it. Sleep is something you have to give into, and that makes it so tricky, right? So I just want to be mindful of what we're talking about and that people understand if you're flexible in it, and the way to be more flexible is to gradually extend your sleep. So if you're somebody who's getting 7 hours and you kind of know you could use more, hey, if you can extend it to 7.5 easily, great. If you're being consistent with that and that's working for you, go and extend it another 15 or 30 minutes. And before you know it, maybe you've really extended your sleep 9-10 hours. I mean, some of these Olympic athletes have reported they need 9 or 10 hours of sleep on the regular for the amount of exertion that they're doing to train for their particular sport. But if you go from, I get 7, now I'm going to spend 10 hours in bed and I better be sleeping for 10 hours and you're getting frustrated, you may actually end up harming yourself and making your sleep worse rather than better.
Right.
So Do you sleep bank, and are your tricks, or have you heard of people that do that? Because I mean, there's a lot of strong data for it, but I'm curious about real life.
So, to be honest, I haven't actually tried sleep banking. I did really focus a lot on sleep in preparing for the 2024 Yukon 1000 because I left 2023 with a decent amount of injuries. And so I was really hyper focused on recovery and not only in training, but also, what I could do to recover during the race as well. I actually had a coach on one of my actually the most recent episode that I released. His name's Matt Jones, and we talked a lot about recovery. And he said the most important thing to consider when trying to recover, he actually referred to sleep as a performance enhancing drug.
It
And
is.
being
I
being
like this
the
Matt Jones.
yeah, being the number one thing that helps athletes recover. And at the end of the day, you can do whatever you want on the water, but you don't actually improve unless you recover from that activity. And so we talked a lot about how sleep can be beneficial for that. But at the end of the day, if we fast forward to a race, that sleep and recovery during sleep isn't always possible, especially if you want to be competitive. So that was really the reason behind the question about, are there ways that athletes can train to prepare for that sleep deprivation so that either the effects of it are minimized. So for example, my brother and I, when we pull over, for our 6 hour break in the Yukon 1000, we couldn't even do simple math towards the end of the race. So pulling over at 10 o'clock at night, trying to figure out, okay, well, what time can we leave in the morning? you know, Adding simply 6 hours to 10 p.m. was difficult for us. And so if there are ways that, that by training or in race interventions, for example, that can help our mind be functioning at a higher level, and not dozing off to sleep while we're paddling, for example, in addition to just de-risking ourselves in a very remote environment. That was really where I was going at with that question. Is there a way that we can help prepare ourselves? But I'll certainly take your recommendation for sleep banking. I actually hadn't thought about that before. I'll certainly try it for my next race.
Yes, as long as it doesn't make things worse. And that's why I'm saying go gradually, because
Sure, that
we
makes sense.
just physiologically are not beings that can do big swings. For people who can kind of shift their sleep a little bit more robustly than others, then hey, you can be a little bit more aggressive, but you kind of know you. And again, it's just sort of looking at it, like you said, as if you shift it to, I must go to sleep, rather than, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, this is a really easy tool to have me get a leg up. And what I find fascinating about what you mentioned is having a coach. And yes, you were now more familiar with the race the following year, just because you kind of had your system down. But I would make the argument that you also prioritize your recovery and prioritize getting a little bit more sleep, and you slept more and finished sooner. So
Yep.
there's probably other factors that contributed to that. Maybe the weather was different or what have you, but it seemed like you had really attributed your success to just being more familiar and being more organized with your approach. But I would dare say sleep probably did factor into that a bit.
Oh, for sure. I felt way more rested each day, specifically because I was just getting more sleep each day, with the exception of the first 2 nights. And that actually leads to my next question, which I think also ties into that sleep banking that you mentioned as well. For example, the night before any race that I've done, it's been extremely hard for me to get to sleep. So not only am I getting massive reductions in sleep per night throughout the race, I'm also not really sleeping the night before very much. And for example, the first 2 nights of the Yukon 1000 in both years, so regardless of how efficient we were in 23 or 24 at our ground game and setting up camp and things like that, I still only slept about 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes each of those first 2 nights. And in comparing that to the night before the race, the reasons for that was because I just couldn't shut my brain down. And so one of the questions that I had for you was specifically related to techniques that athletes can use to help shut their brains down at a time in which they need to sleep. So even for example, the Yukon 1000 is very regimented. So you have to stop at certain times. And if my mind's still going and I can't get to sleep, then that 6 hours of rest time can be wasted. Additionally, for example, in the Alabama 650, if you're racing with another partner, even though you can stop and sleep anytime, that other partner might not be ready to fall asleep. And even though one person is really ready to pass out and get some good sleep, it could be challenging for the teammate to also fall asleep, and which would be ultimately detrimental to the team as you think about the race as a whole. So that's really kind of the where I'm going at with that question is, are there techniques to help racers shut down their mind and fall asleep quickly that could be used as an advantage versus other competitors?
There are, in fact, a few tips that you can employ to help you get a leg up on maximizing your rest during a big race that causes a lot of sleep deprivation. However, I'm going to need you to tune in next week for part 2 to hear the rest. Thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube.
Struggling with sleep? Dr. Cole is here to help. Whether you need a comprehensive sleep coaching program, suspect you have sleep apnea, or simply seeking a second opinion, she's available for consultation in New Jersey, New York, California, and Georgia, with more states coming soon. Schedule your free 10-minute review of services today to find out which visit is right for you at AskTheSleepMD.com and start your journey to better sleep with a trusted sleep expert.
Please be advised that the Sleep is My Waking Passion podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice. Always consult your healthcare provider for personalized guidance. For my full disclaimer, please visit AskTheSleepMD.com, and while you're there, don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter. Sweet dreams and happy listening.